Moving on to agenda item number 3, a presentation from Community Development Director Michael Mays regarding Boulder City's renewable lease revenue and benefits to the community.
Good evening, Commissioners. So at last month's meeting, you had a land management application for consideration for HydroStar, and this brought up a conversation with the Commissioners regarding the benefits to the solar leases, and in particular, how it benefits our residents. And so in response, staff wanted to put together a presentation of information to share with the Commission and to answer questions. In addition to myself, we also have Brok Armantrout and Joe Stubitz here to help with answering your questions, not only as it relates to solar lease revenues, but where that energy goes, and again, the benefits to our residents. Wanted to show a map, which is the El Dorado Valley, and it identifies where the current solar lease revenue areas are. You can see the different colors which refer to different leases. This also denotes future solar lease potential development in the Black Hills area. The one thing I wanted to point out is that you will see the dry lake bed is on this map, and a majority of the dry lake bed is not shown for solar leases. Several years ago, the council approved a resolution which preserves the dry lake bed, the remaining dry lake bed, for recreational purposes. So that will never be coming before you for any type of solar or renewable energy leases. What percentage of city land is being dedicated for renewable energy uses? The city is 135,000 acres, almost 136,000 acres in size. 75%, approximately 103,000 acres, is zoned open space. 12.5% of the city land, or 17,000 acres, is zoned energy resources. This is either projects that have already been built and, of course, leased, or are underway. Based on the current land management process list, approximately an additional 1,600 acres of additional city-owned land could be available for renewable energy. These are applications that have gone through the land management process, come before the Planning Commission, and have the potential for the City Council to enter into a future lease. That would add another 1.2% of our total land dedicated to energy resource uses, so approximately 14%. That would be the maximum.
Go ahead. I was just going to ask, does that include the hydro plant that we discussed last? Perfect.
No.
So we already have 12.5% allocated to this. So how much of that 12.5% are we actually using? Is it all used already for? Is it all spoken for?
It is not all spoken for. There is Black Hills North, which is approximately 1,100 acres that has been through the land management process, but the city has not gone out to RFP on that project. There is an additional approximately 300 acres in the El Dorado Valley, and Brok will correct me, that are other potential future leases which have come through the Planning Commission, but we haven't entered into leases and haven't gone through the RFP process.
So the other question I have is, because of the duration of these leases, being there 40, 50 years, or however long they end up being, even though it's still a lease, with that amount of land being tied up for that long, why don't we put it up to vote for the city? So take chunks of land and say, hey, we're planning on putting this up for solar or energy efficient or energy resources. Why don't we put chunks of land together and then let the city vote on it, and then it's all together already, and then that takes the burden off of the city council and us as a planning commission. So the city would already vote, the people of the city would vote, just like we were going to sell property, we're going to lease it for 40 years, let the city help decide.
Number one, ballot questions have gone out in the past asking, is it appropriate to lease city land for solar purposes in the El Dorado Valley? Those were approved by the voters of the community. In addition, they've added hydro and wind as additional renewable energy resources that could be leased in the valley. And then secondly, the public has the input through the land management process. It's the reason this whole process was created over 20 years ago, so that long before the city council entertained a lease for that land, the public had an opportunity to weigh in on the appropriateness of moving forward with that. And the Planning Commission saw that through the HydroStar application, where residents expressed their concerns about that potential lease.
May I add something, please, in response to that? That's a question that's been asked before, and with respect to going out to voter approval for leasing land, and that would hamstring the city so bad. It's the job of the city council and the job of staff to determine these types of things. And if you have a solar company coming to you and wants to lease land, and you have to wait 2 years to put it on the ballot for them to get an answer, the lease is gone. They have to operate under a certain time frame. They have power purchase agreements, and it's just not feasible.
Well, I'm just saying that, we allocate land for it already, and then we're not even using the 12.5. We just keep voting on more and more on top of the 12.5 that we already have. So why wouldn't, if we're going to allocate more to property toward that, I think we should be able to have the public vote on that. I mean, and I get the fact we already have 12%. We're not even using all that. We just keep getting more and more, and we might have 12% already in leases, but obviously it's taking more than 2 years because I haven't been here. I've been here under 5 years, and we haven't used all of it.
So another important consideration as part of the land management process, it stipulates that if 3 years have gone by and the land has not been entered into a lease, then it goes automatically back to the city council, and they reevaluate continuing to have that land remain on the list. And over the last few years, council has said, you know what? That's no longer advancing, so take it off the list. So, where does the lease revenue go? Our finance department estimates that for this fiscal year, we will collect approximately $19.2 million in lease revenue. And as you can see, they have put together this nice illustration with 3 buckets. 70%, or approximately $13.4 million, goes into the city's general fund. 10%, or $1.9 million, goes into special revenue funds, which is basically a rainy day fund for the city. 20%, or $3.8 million, goes to capital improvements. What's important with this
Michael,
slide...
if I could interrupt, just for
Sure.
a point clarification for the public out there, those numbers do not fluctuate annually, and they are not arbitrary numbers, correct? The breakout of 70% to the general fund, 10% to special revenue, 20% to capital improvement. How do we get to those numbers, and are they flexible?
Yes, actually, in the city's charter, which I'm going to highlight later, it is specific. It says that with solar lease revenue funds, 80% has to go to the general fund, 20% has to go to capital improvements. So that's where it spells it out, and no, it can't change. We'd have to amend the charter.
The 70%, 10%, 20%, where would I be able to find those numbers broken down and itemized?
In terms of revenue, we have it within our annual budget, and our entire budget is on the city's website.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. So this is an important consideration because I'm going to talk about this later. This is our general fund revenue for this fiscal year, $40 million. broken down into percentages of where that revenue comes from. And the 2 points I wanted to make with this slide is that the solar lease revenues are inclusive in the rents and royalties at 34%. 34% of our general fund revenues come from solar leases. You'll also note that only 6.4% come from property taxes. Another way to look at this is to compare the solar lease revenue to how much we spend on public safety operating expenses. So what we have here, and this is also another slide from the finance department that shows each fiscal year. In blue is the solar lease revenue, and in orange is our public safety expenses. As you can see, the solar lease revenue is an important funding source for public safety, and without those revenues, then we'd have to be looking at alternatives to support this, which I'll go into later.
By public safety operating expenditures, I'm assuming that the police department and the fire department consist of most of that expense. Is that true?
Correct.
I'm a little bit disturbed by, a town which basically has, where the population does not grow, and but our public safety operating expenditures sure do. That makes me a little nervous. But maybe that's a subject for another topic, but that's something I think we should be considering. Sorry.
Okay. So how do residents benefit? Other communities in southern Nevada fund their operations through growth, through development fees, property tax revenue, and additional properties being brought into their community, and through gaming. Boulder City does not. This lease revenue, the solar lease revenue, allows the city to fund essential city services without growth and without gaming. Because as you all know, we are unique in that we are the only city and one of two government entities, the township I think is the other one, that prohibit gaming in Nevada. Everyone else does allow it. This helps the city to maintain the high quality of life expected by our residents. And we're able to do this while maintaining the lowest property tax rate in the state of Nevada. I think that's an important point to reemphasize that we do have the lowest property tax rate. And in fact, when you look at this graph, this graphically illustrates that. Boulder City is in red. You'll see all the other municipalities and their comparative tax rates. Mesquite, which is the second lowest, their property tax rate is double ours. One of the other questions that Commission had was, where does our power come from? And so we wanted to put together this graph. This came from our utility department, and certainly Mr. Stubitz can elaborate on it further, that with respect to renewable energy, we have this graph broken down showing both hydro and solar. And it's interesting to note that during the spring months, 81% of our power needs come from hydro and solar. And then obviously, when we don't receive enough from hydro and solar, then we have to go out to the marketplace to purchase the additional power. So one of the other questions that was brought up by the commission is, why is the solar lease revenue unable to help reduce utility bills? As I noted before in the charter, we are required by charter to allocate these funds to 80% to the general fund and 20% to capital. In addition, the utility fund, which collects utility rates, fees from our businesses and residents, and then uses that to operate our utilities, it's an enterprise fund. And pursuant to government accounting standards, enterprise fund needs to be fully funded by the fees generated for those utilities. Boulder City also has one of the lowest utility rates in the state. And there is an impact if we start pursuing a lot of additional solar lease revenue that would impact negatively the hydropower that we receive. Hydropower is one of our most affordable power purchases. And so if you end up with power purchase agreements for more solar, more than what we need because we're getting a great deal with the hydropower, that would negatively impact our ratepayers. So that's another important consideration. Why is the city limited in negotiating free solar? Until battery storage became a viable way to store solar power, the problem with solar power is it's only during the day. It's only during days that are not cloudy. And our problem is, for the city, we are required to have what's called a firm power source, meaning power 24/7. And so up until the last several years, before there was battery storage, we couldn't rely on solar power as a firm power source. And so we couldn't negotiate agreements to receive some of that power for Boulder City's benefit. Another consideration as it relates to this question is the developers of the solar, they enter into what's called power purchase agreements, PPAs. This obligates them to deliver that power to a certain entity, whether it's a utility or a particular business. They enter into those agreements to then finance the development of the solar project. So that is a major factor into them being able to give us free solar energy in the consideration of those lease agreements. With the hydro sources that supply roughly 50% of our power, as I noted before, we got a really good deal with those hydropower rates, and we don't want that to be impacted negatively by the solar. And the bottom line is, if we were to agree to free power, then that impacts the lease revenue the city receives, which positively impacts residents with their property taxes.
You'd mentioned prior to a few years ago, battery storage with solar. Is that something with the innovation of that? Is that a new element that we are considering as we negotiate things now or pursue this at all, or even as a city? Do we look at as battery backup as a feasible option?
Yes, and in fact, going back to the slide, which breaks down where we receive our power from renewable energies. And what this shows is, with the solar, this comes from the town site solar project, the most recent solar project. We were able to negotiate 5 megawatts of power that we can receive. And so that's where, with this portfolio, we have now hydro and solar because of the battery storage.
Back to the revenue, what kind of rent growth do we get on those leases?
What kind of
Rent
sorry?
growth?
Rate growth?
Yeah.
I'm going to bring up Brok for that one.
Because I know they're getting more money for power. We should be getting more for our land.
I'm Brok Armantrout, the city's contract real estate manager. To answer your question, it varies. As the PPAs, each one of them have also vary. The Copper Mountain projects, Copper Mountain 1 has no increase, but Copper Mountain 5 increases annually 2%. It all depends on when they entered into a contract with the city and what their PPA was that they entered into with their off-taker. So it varies from nothing to up to 3% at our highest one. We tried to get it adjusted to CPI during negotiations. That fell flat just primarily because they needed predictability with their lease payments, since their income or their income was tied to their PPA, and they knew how much power they could generate based on math and number of megawatt hours that they could generate during the day. So they knew exactly how much money they'd be bringing in based on the PPA, and if we had a variable increase each year based on CPI, the Consumer Price Index, they'd be upside down quickly, since their PPAs typically are locked in for 20 years at a certain rate, or the rate only increases so much each year. Most of them have a locked-in rate for 20 years where they're static for the entire 20 years. And then they renegotiate when the PPAs expire at 20 years and ideally to something higher. PPAs vary. One of the earliest projects out there managed to get 15 cents a kilowatt hour or $150 a megawatt hour. That was back in 2007. Now you're lucky to get it for 1.7 cents or $17 a megawatt hour. Just because there's so much solar on the market, at 2 in the afternoon, they can't give it away because nobody wants it. That's why battery storage is now so attractive. And that's why the city's moving towards battery storage as our next entry into the energy field.
And to continue on that, I was going to say, is that something now in practice as we negotiate those fixed increases? I know you said everyone's different, but from 20 years ago, we can't go back. But is that now common practice to bake that into those negotiations?
Well, we bake 2 to 3% into our lease negotiations. It's just our standard offer. They always come back with something less, and we hold firm.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Brok. So where does the solar energy that's generated in the El Dorado Valley go? Our solar fields generate approximately 2,435 megawatts. And this is just some examples of where that power is being utilized. NV Energy is one example, the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, Pacific Georgia and Electric, and San Diego Gas and Electric. But there are other users of that power. And we are uniquely positioned because of our proximity to Hoover Dam and the transmission lines that take the hydropower throughout the West. That's where the solar companies are able to tie into that to distribute their power as well. That's why you don't see solar fields out in the middle of Nevada where there's no transmission lines. It's very expensive to extend those transmission lines to open areas. And so that's why we have a lot of interest in Boulder City. So just in summary, city has the lowest property tax rate and one of the lowest utility rates in the state of Nevada, and it's because of our energy lease revenue. Had the city not negotiated renewable energy leases 20 years ago, the city at that time, in order to maintain the services that our residents expect, would have had to increase our property taxes or greatly reduce the services that we provide to our residents. A significant majority of our land, 75%, is still dedicated to open space. And then finally, the city is able to maintain important services for residents without growth because of this lease revenue. It puts Boulder City in a unique position because we don't have the growth that the other jurisdictions have, and we don't have the gaming revenue. And so with that, myself, Brok, and Joe can answer any additional questions.
I have a question. It's probably best suited for Joe. At one time, and I might have mentioned this at last month's meeting, when people have asked this question before, there was talk about if we became a distributor of power, it would likely alert the PUC, and we'd have to become part of the PUC rather than run our own utilities. Is that not the case?
You know, I'm not certain about that. There are different regulatory requirements that open up if you're a generator owner, and that's, based on a certain megawatt amount. So we're based on our population, we're able to stay outside of the Public Utility Commission of Nevada. And that's something that we've lobbied for and, have participated with our Nevada Rural Electric Association and other members.
Since you're up here, Joe, I've got a question for you. We've talked the substation, and I just wanted to kind of have you from your technical side. A lot of folks say, well, if we build that, why can't we just run a line in and plug it in? Would you mind just walking the dog on how they've got to plug into a substation, that it doesn't matter if we put a power plant right here in the grass, we're not able to just run an extension cord to it?
Sure. So Western Area Power Administration, part of the Department of Energy, is the balancing authority in the region. So Meade substation is within the city limits of Boulder City. That's where we get all of our energy. We've got 2 connections, one at the 69 kV portion of that substation and one at the 230 kV connection. So these facilities, basically, they're getting into the queue for a transmission agreement to connect into the Meade substation, or they're going out and connecting to wherever they're ending up and building all that infrastructure on their own. So that process takes a certain amount of time, and there's a certain amount of investment that goes into it.
And it's a infrastructure framework that's restrictive. They can't just go in and build their own line and tap in and send a line down to my house and call it a day.
No, it's federally regulated.
Absolutely. I appreciate that. I know that that's one of the ideas or one of the areas of concern that people just didn't quite understand. We've got them all here. Why can't we just extrapolate power from them? And so thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions for Joe, I guess, from the engineer's side? We'll continue on. Any
So
other-
down in the valley, we have solar and a gas fire plant too, right?
Yes. Well, I mean, it's not ours, but yeah, there
It's
is a
Nevada
gas fired
Energy's.
plant. Yep, that's San Diego Gas and Electric. All right, thank you.
I'll run us one other question, kind of financing, and Michael, we have talked about this before. Did a wonderful job kind of explaining the administrative side, that we, the end ratepayer, can't individually get a direct benefit, but we had kind of said that the mayor and council could, if they really wanted to, just take a line item through the general fund and call it a subsidy and write it out there. But at the end of the day, they're still robbing Peter to pay Paul, because now those monies, instead of being available to one or the other. So want to reiterate and ask and make sure that we're seeing the picture correctly there with respect to finances, that without muddying the waters, there really is no financial way to get a direct benefit to us, the end user, without taking money from our general fund and just calling it a subsidy.
And it goes against the principles of a enterprise fund should support itself.
Absolutely. Any other questions of staff? And I will highlight and point out that it's our intent to gather some of the feedback here in this presentation and create kind of a information campaign out there. So as this continues to come up every so often, folks in the public are armed with information here. So please, if there's any obscure questions, comments, concerns, this is our appropriate arena to do so. Well, shoot, doggy, my wife's going to be happy. I'm going to be home for dinner. Michael, I want to applaud you and your staff. Brok, Joe, thank you for sticking around after. A phenomenal job. I know it came out as just kind of a good idea swirling around. We wanted to do it at some point in the next few months. And you put together a phenomenal presentation, white paper, supporting materials, and all of this stuff. So thank you, and accolades to you and the staff.
Thank you very much. Obviously, a lot of support from the other departments to make this happen, in particular utilities, finance, and the city attorney. Thanks.
Yes.
I just, it was a good, informative presentation, and I applaud you, Michael, for it. I would just suggest to people that, the graph that said, well, where does the revenue go? And the majority of it goes to public safety. I would recommend that anyone who is still interested does as I will do and look into itemization of what's being spent for public safety. Public safety, specifically our police department, is always number one from what I've seen in the city's budget as far as expenses. And, it'd be great to see some of that money come back to the city. I'd like to see the police department and the fire department's budgets itemized. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
And Michael, once again, that's on the website under Finance Department? Because it's out there, and there's a lot of great information in there.
Even made it even easier if they go to bcnv.org/FY25 budget.
Bing.
Pulls up the budget page. I just verified it to make sure I wasn't on drugs. I made the link, so I wanted to make sure it worked.
Fantastic. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
And the first link in there is we actually have a digital budget book that makes it easier to interact with the budget.
Navigate through there.
And see charts and where the money goes and where it comes from.
Absolutely. Being a finance guy,
Could you repeat that link again, Brok, please?
bcnv.org/FY25 budget. So FY25 budget as one word.